Hey, Georgia Studies. We are going to start our last unit, which will be the Civil War before Christmas. So I'm hoping we can finish the whole unit. There's a lot in it, so it's kind of divided into two parts, things leading up to the Civil War, and then how Georgia was affected by the Civil War. So let me just talk to you about a few things, just as an introduction for the week. So we're going to look at those important issues and events that led to the Civil War, which includes, of course, slavery, states' rights, nullification, the Compromise of 1850 and the Georgia Platform, the Dred Scott case, a case that went to the Supreme Court, Abraham Lincoln's election of 1860, and the debate over secession in Georgia. So up until this time that we think of as the Civil War, the time leading up to it was called the antebellum period in history of the United States. There was quite a lot of differences in the North and the South, especially economically. The North had a lot of money, a lot of rich people lived in the North. The South, we depended on agriculture. We didn't have any factories. We didn't have a lot of large cities, some large cities, but most people lived in rural areas. So they were isolated, they were spread out. Imagine living in a big city. You live very, very close to other people. You kind of depend on other people. And in the South, people didn't know what that felt like because people were so spread out. So the North had industry. The development of the steam engine happened during this time, so factories really took off. People could produce a lot faster than they ever have in history before. They also had the advantage of swift rivers and waterfalls to power its mills and factories. They had a lot of natural harbors for conducting foreign trades, a lot of foreign trade going on between industry in the North and other countries in the South. Up until the time the cotton gin was developed or, invented, we didn't have a lot to exchange. I mean, we did have some things, but not as much as the North. The South had an agricultural economy. So we have, of course, better, or not better, well, maybe better, warm weather and fertile soil in the South. We grew tobacco, corn, rice, indigo. Some of those things were from, our trustee days. And then, of course, in the late 1790s, what happened? Eli Whitney created the cotton gin, and cotton became king in the South. So it totally affected our economy and made us very dependent on that one crop, cotton. So in the North, like I was saying, the cities they had big cities. People lived very close to other people. They were very interdependent on each other. In the South, we didn't have big factories. We didn't have very many big cities at all. So a lot of people lived out on rural farms. Your closest neighbor may not be, but I don't know, closest neighbor might be 3 or 4 or 5 miles down the road. So that meant that families were isolated. They were more independent. They could kind of take care of themselves. They didn't need a whole lot of other people in order to sustain themselves and their families. So when events happened, they didn't affect the North and the South in the same way. So the federal government decided they were going to place tariffs or taxes on imported items. So when we imported something, they were going to tax those items in order to protect northern businesses. Well, guess what? The South didn't have factories. So that extra tariff, that extra piece of profit didn't have any effect on the South at all. We didn't have many things to import, and so we didn't have any benefit from this. So what would happen when our government placed tariffs on items that we imported? Well, other countries did the same thing. So in retaliation, to retaliate, countries like Great Britain imposed the same tariffs, and so they stopped importing as much cotton from the South as they had because they had to pay more for the same amount of cotton. So that tariff was very bad for the South. There was no economic benefit. It was only a hardship to the South. So by the 1930s, these tariffs were lowered, but it had already done harm. The South felt like well, the federal government, when they made this decision, they didn't think about the South at all. They only thought about how they could benefit the North. And so there was already this division feeling that had set in, and people were starting to get a bad taste in their mouths. So here was one of the political cartoons that came out at the time. So the guy on the left represents the North. It said that he was fattened on taxes, which a protective tariff authorizes and enables him to collect from the public. So he's nice. He's a large man. He has been fattened up by these tariffs. So look at the guy on the right that represents the farmer from the South, fattened on promises of good things, high wages, and cheap living as a result of protection. So they're making fun of, they're saying that the government promised us these things, and look at us, we're not benefiting from it at all. So South Carolina, eventually they were the first state to secede, but even before they actually seceded, years earlier than that, they were so infuriated with these tariffs that Senator John Calhoun from South Carolina said that states had the right to nullify federal laws. He said it was a state's right. So that became the big issue of the day. So remember under Articles of Confederation, states were given almost all the power and the federal government didn't have much at all. Well, the United States Constitution changed that, but a lot of states felt like we are going to do the things that benefit us the most. So we have the right, if the government passes a law and it doesn't do us any good, it only causes us harm, then we have a right to either ignore that federal law or to consider it void, and we don't have to follow it. So that became a big debate between states' rights and federal rights or federal laws. States saying, you know what, we're not going to participate in that federal law because we are going to do what's best for South Carolina or Georgia. So South Carolina threatened to secede from the Union. They're like, if you're going to do only what's good for the North, then we're leaving the Union. We're not going to stay. Georgia wanted to join them, kind of. They were torn. And so then President Andrew Jackson actually said, South Carolina, if you leave the Union, then you are considered an enemy and we will declare war on you. So because of President Andrew Jackson's threat, South Carolina did stay in the Union until, of course, 1860. But this kept about 12 years of peace, kind of peace. They were still unhappy, but it kept them in the Union for quite a bit longer. All right, so some vocabulary real quick. What do these things mean? Well, states' rights means that some states believe that they had the right to make their own choices, their own laws, and if the federal law, they didn't agree with the federal law, they could ignore it. They didn't have to enforce it. Nullification meant, well, that's it. They decided that we're going to nullify a federal law. If we don't like it, we're going to ignore it. We're not going to enforce it. To secede, that is the word that means that we are going to pull out of something, that we're going to leave something that we're part of. So when we talk about secession, that's the word that we're using. And then, of course, tariff is a tax on imported goods. All right, so moving on. So the issue of slavery, so, people realize that the Civil War was about slavery, but it started out more as a discussion on the state of Georgia should get to make a decision about issues, including the issue of slavery. South Carolina said, the federal government doesn't have the right to tell us whether we're going to have slaves or nullification, or we can ignore these rules or tariffs. And so it's really states' rights had more of an issue at the beginning of the Civil War, but then during the Civil War, slavery went to first place. That's what the issue was, especially after Abraham Lincoln came out with the Emancipation Proclamation. It became a war about or against slavery. All right, so at the time, before we became a country, while we were still colonies, all 13 colonies had slavery. Now, Georgia was actually the very last colony to get slaves, because remember when we were a trustee colony, that was actually against one of our rules. We weren't allowed to have slavery. When we became a royal colony, that's when they allowed slavery. But at first, all 13 colonies had slavery present. Over time, though, and after the American Revolution and we became a country, the northern states started to emancipate slavery. So here are the years that states ended slavery. So Vermont was the first one. And then like New Jersey had slaves until 1804. So abolitionists were people that fought against slavery from the North, brought attention to how slaves were being treated. So some people, some people would go their whole lives and never meet a Black person or an African American. And so they were like, yeah, slavery sounds bad, but it doesn't really affect me. And I don't really care one way or another. However, once these abolitionists started getting a voice, finding their voices, and they would make speeches and they would print pamphlets and they would write books, once you know something is so terrible, then you can't ignore it. And so that's what happened. These abolitionists started influencing thousands and thousands of people's view on this thing, this evil thing called slavery. And so people became more and more and more impassioned about it because of abolitionists like Frederick Douglass. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote this book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It described the evils of slavery. And the story goes that when Abraham Lincoln met her, after reading her book, when he went and greeted her, he said to her, "So you're the little lady that caused this great war." So he was talking about her book and how her writing influenced so many people to fight against this evil thing called slavery. So he was saying that, you made an impact on this country by your words, by what you've written. Harriet Jacobs, these are just a few. Of course, there's a lot more abolitionists that I'm sure you've learned about and you'll talk about as you go through school. So states were unhappy. We started off with tariffs, started talking about states' rights, started talking about nullification. So as states, so in order for a territory to become a state, that area had to have a certain population. Well, over time, as people start moving west and more the populations are increasing in the west, states wanted to be added to the Union. Well, the states wanted to keep the number of free states and slave states the same so that they would have equal representation in Congress, right? So every time a state was added, there was this huge outcry on whether they were going to be a free state or a slave state. So their government created a bunch of these promises and compromises over about 30, 40, 50 years to try to keep the states happy. So it says, as the United States expanded westward, new territories were created, and the question arose, well, is this new state going to be a slave state or a free state? So in 1820, we came up with this compromise called the Missouri Compromise. It stated that they kind of drew a line, and they said, all right, all states added south of this line is going to be added as slave states. And if a territory becomes a state above this line, then they're going to be admitted to the Union as a free state, so that we'll keep the balance. We're going to keep it balanced. This compromise kept the North and South together for a little bit of time, but the California Gold Rush in 1849 expanded the United States and more problems developed. So this Missouri Compromise happened in 1820. Well, like it said, about 30 years later, gold was discovered in California, and people started moving out west even more rapidly. And eventually, California they had enough population to become a state. So this is what the Missouri Compromise looked like. This is in 1820. So this was the line. It said any state added south of this line will be a slave state. Any added above this line will become a free state. obviously Missouri was going to be a slave state. And so what happened is Missouri and Maine joined the Union at the same time. Missouri was admitted as a slave state because Maine was going to be a free state, and they were trying to keep those numbers the same. So that kept people happy for about 30 years. Well, in 1850, we had to have another compromise. So in 1850, the gold rush had happened. California had enough people to become a state. California's admission to the Union would once again imbalance the power in the Senate and in Congress. If California entered the Union, it would give the North control of the House and the Senate. The South felt that Congress and its lawmakers would work to end slavery and keep it from expanding, so a compromise was developed. So the Compromise of 1850 allowed California to join as a free state in exchange for what they called the Fugitive Slave Law. Now, up until this time, if a slave was in the South and he escaped and he went to the North to a free state, once he made it to that free state, he was considered a freed man. So he could stay up in the North and he could live his life, and, you know, people would leave him alone. I mean, there was still prejudice and racism, but at least he wasn't a slave anymore, right? But the Fugitive Slave Act said if a Black person is found in the North and you suspect that they're a runaway slave and they don't have the proper paperwork, then you have to return that slave to its owner. You have to do everything you can to return that person to its owner, or that property to its owner. And so that was part of this compromise. So in Georgia, we're like, okay, we're going to leave the Union. We're not happy with this anymore. If California is added as a free state, however, if you guys will force the North to follow the Fugitive Slave Law, we're going to stay part of the Union. So here is a map of the Compromise of 1850. So at the time of 1850, all of these yellow states were considered slave states. All of the green ones, including now Oregon and California, were considered free states. We have some propaganda that was posted. It says, fugitive slaves, attention. The slave hunter is among us. Be on your guard. An arrest is planned for tonight. So they would try to warn each other. Be ready to receive them whenever they come. So everyone was very aware of what was going on in the North and the South about slavery. So like I said, Georgia was ready to leave the Union. However, a document was written to support the Compromise of 1850 as long as the North enforced the Fugitive Slave Act. During this time, Georgia did not want to leave the Union, even though a lot of people were unhappy. Alexander Stephens and Robert Toombs spoke for Georgia. They said that as long as the North supported the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Law, Georgia would stay in the Union. So because of this Georgia platform, we stayed in the Union for another 11 years. So now we have this man called Dred Scott. He was a slave. His master treated him very well, although he was considered his property, but his master allowed him to get married and have a family, and he traveled with him. And he had a good relationship with his master, so wherever his master went, he went with him. So his master even went to a couple of free states, and he lived there with him as his slave. And then they moved back to Missouri, which was a slave state. Well, when they were back in Missouri, the master actually died. And Dred Scott and other abolitionists got together and they said, actually, you lived in free states for quite a while, and so you deserve your freedom. It's not your fault that you guys moved back to Missouri. You lived in free states. You should be a freed man. And so he decided to sue for his freedom. Dred Scott was a slave who traveled with his master to several free states while his master was alive. After Dred Scott's master died, he got together with several abolitionists and sued for his freedom. In 1857, in a case called Dred Scott versus Sanford, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that Dred Scott was not a citizen, that he was actually property. And not being a citizen means that he didn't have the right to sue for anything, much less his freedom. So The Supreme Court, because of the way slavery was considered at the time, slaves were considered property. That was their decision. They said that you don't have the right, you don't even have the right to sue. You're not even a citizen of the United States. So the citizens, African Americans, didn't get their freedom until, well, they were emancipated in the 13th Amendment, but the 14th Amendment is when they actually became citizens of the United States, right? And so up until this time, they weren't even considered citizens. And so this was considered a huge defeat for the North, the abolitionists in the North, and it was considered a victory for Southern states that wanted to keep slavery legal. So right in the middle of all this chaos, all of this unhappiness, all of this fighting and bickering between the North and the South, we had a presidential election. Sounds familiar, right, guys? So our crazy year 2020, this isn't the only time our country has been, you know, in some rough times. People seem to be unhappy with each other. People seem to be in disagreements. And then right in the middle of that is an election. So we have the election of 1860. And so the rumors of a civil war had been going on for so long that this was a huge deal. Well, the Democratic Party actually allowed two men to run for president. We had a Northern Democrat and a Southern Democrat. Well, guess what that did to the Democratic vote? It split it. So John Bell was considered part of the Constitutional Union Party, which was a new party, and another brand new party was called a Republican Party, and Abraham Lincoln was the only candidate out of the Republican Party, this new party that had formed in order to end slavery. And Abraham Lincoln was elected. His name wasn't even on the ballot in the South. In any Southern state, he didn't get a single vote, and he still won the presidency because the Democratic vote was split, and because John Bell basically carried, I think, 2, maybe 3 states total. So Abraham Lincoln won. So let's look at this map. So all of these light blue states they voted for Breckinridge. So he ended up with 72 electoral votes. So at the time, you only needed 152 electoral votes to win. Today, of course, it's 270. And so all of these red states voted for Abraham Lincoln. Now look at California. California got 4 electoral votes at the time. I looked it up today to see what the difference was. Remember, electoral votes are based on population. Today, California, if a candidate wins California, that's worth 55 electoral votes. Interestingly enough, the biggest number on here is New York, which is 35 electoral votes. Well, today, New York gets, I wrote 29. That doesn't sound right. I thought it was 32. Maybe it is 29. So that's not much difference back in 1860. Now, Texas, look at Texas. Breckinridge won Texas, only got 4 electoral votes. Today, that would be 38 electoral votes. So Abraham Lincoln did not win. He got only like 45% of the popular vote, but he had 180 electoral votes, and you only needed, back in 1860, you only needed 152 to win. So he won. Now Douglas carried this state, Missouri, and these little territories up here, these little slivers up here. And he had, even though he only had 12 electoral votes, he had more votes than the other guys that ran besides Abraham Lincoln. He wasn't very far behind Abraham Lincoln, but he only got 12 electoral votes. That's how our electoral college works. All right, so anyway, so South Carolina, once Abraham Lincoln was elected president, they were convinced that he was going to end slavery. And so South Carolina seceded. So they seceded in 1860, right after Abraham Lincoln was elected president. After South Carolina left the Union, Georgia said, you know what, I think we're going to go too. And so Georgia held a secession convention to discuss leaving the Union. Despite pleas from many who felt that Georgia should remain in the Union, Georgia seceded in January of 1861. We were no longer part of the United States of America. Our secession ordinance, the document that caused our secession, stated, "The people of Georgia, having dissolved their political connection with the government of the United States of America, present to their Confederates and the world the causes which have led to the separation. For the last 10 years, we have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slave-holding Confederate states with reference to the subject of African slavery." So, once Georgia and other states left the Union, they joined another nation called the Confederate States of America. So we still had the Union, the United States of America. The Southern states formed the Confederate States of America. They had their own president, their own vice president. So anyway, so of course, right after that is when we have the Civil War, and we will talk about that in just a few days. So anyway, that was just an overview of the events that led up to the Civil War. So I hope you guys enjoy reading and learning about the events that happened during that time, and I will check in with you guys soon.